We'll try to synthesize some of the things we've seen in the past three topics. Very interesting discussions and a lot of very interesting ideas. I'll try to summarize some of the arguments. Also propose a possible solution, at least the beginning of a solution. I don't think I can pretend to do more than that. So there have been two. If we look in general, there's two main directions, right? One is toward AI as a regular tool. I'm going to put some quotes here because it's probably more complex than that. And one towards AI as a maker. I'm also putting some quotes because maybe not everybody think of it the same way. And of course, it has some implications, and these notions also relate are now really loaded with a lot of things we've seen before in the ethics theory from the Greeks and particularly Aristotle. So now we've seen that through the discussion that there are some pushbacks on both sides, right? So I'm going to try to summarize those. It might not be complete, but I'm going to try to summarize those. There is no really any much arguments in favor of AI as a doer, I say, or actor. If we take really this in the sense of praxis, and so I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to really study these two options. I'm going to start with the pushback for the AI as a regular tool because that's pretty easy, and I think even those who argued, that's why I put the quotes, even those who argued for that were kind of obviously a bit bothered by those obvious counter arguments. Well, there are several counter arguments. I mean, we have a tool that is fully automated, right? In a way that a hammer or a knife is not really. And in any of the examples of the tools at the time, or even in the Middle Ages, or even in the more modern philosophies, there's no mention of anything automated like a computer program, even less like an AI, right? And an AI also includes some kind of notion of, deliberation. There's some notion of decision and rationality, right? Rationality that we can see in the AI process, and that of course all of these terms are used to talk about the human activity in the process, right? In the capacity for that is art, techne, or even the capacity that is practical wisdom for acting, for praxis, right? The phronesis, right? So there is this, right? And there is a sense, and that's where we really started this whole investigation, that really an AI unfolding its work really is like an activity, energeia. And that was a starting point, right, for us, is to look at it. Well, yeah, there is really a beginning and an end, right? There is there is a program, right? And you start the execution and it triggers a certain activity that really reminds us of the energia of someone building something, right? And at the end you get some kind of output, right? This diagram really resembles the diagram we have for the maker, right? Where we have the person with the capacity, the art capacity, building, a certain external object. And we'll go back to that, but it reminds us of that, right? So, and here also we have energia. And yeah, and in that case, in the case of Techne, this is going to be poiesis, right? In particular, with the poieton being the object, right? But we don't need too much the Greek word here. We're gonna pass that. So that's really a strong pushback, right? And finally, I mean, the notion of intelligence in AI, right? I mean, the imitation of the actual human intelligence. So it's really human-like. I mean, none of those look like a regular tool in the sense of, again, right, the typical one is the hammer, but you could think of other tools, but none of these characteristics actually match the idea of a regular tool. And more importantly, in terms of the notion of good and bad, which is what we've explored in this topic, it has direct consequences that none of those would tend to make us think that the good and the bad is completely external to the tool, to the AI, right? In the case of the hammer, I mean, you have a good hammer, right? You can talk about a good hammer and a bad hammer, right? You can have a good watch. A good watch is a watch that gives you appropriate time. A good hammer is a hammer that when you use it can hammer, nails properly. So there is a notion of good and bad in the tools, and that's very true, but it's not in the sense of ethics, right? It's not in the sense of what is good for man, for humanity, okay? In the sense of it just really relates just to a function. Does it match the function that it is expected to fulfill? That's limited to that, right? But in all of these notions, automated deliberation, decision, rationality, activity, intelligence, all of these kind of involved an ethics at the heart of AI itself, right? You can't think of the ethics being completely separated from the AI because it is because it engages this activity, this decision, this rationality, this intelligence in itself, right? So it has some important consequences. Now, okay, so that's on this side, and again, these pushbacks are pretty natural. I mean, if you're a computer scientist, particularly maybe a major in humanities, would not see that as easily as you would. But given your background, it seems that I would expect, and it's the way it feels in the discussions, that you would naturally be inclined to see those pushbacks, like say, yeah, no, it can't really be just another regular tool, right? Now, the ones that are not as obvious for a computer science major are the pushbacks on the other side, right? For the AI as a maker. And so I'm going to spend a little bit more time on those. And they are more or less clear, so I'll try to make them as clear as possible. The the first one that I would mention is trying to make sure I have all of them here. Yeah. So if really AI is a maker, right? So you would have here the code, right? The AI. I mean, it's an oversimplification, of course, and the output would be really the external object, right? And the AI would have this kind of capacity, this art, right? And the activity is really the process of computational process, computation, and here, we talk about making. But the computation would be a making in some sense of the outputs, right? Okay, so here there are several interesting consequences, right? If we look at it that way, that means that the ethics this time is really involved, both in terms of what can be good or bad, and we talked about this in the content of the topic, is both going to be in the capacity itself of the AI, right? The capacity to produce something good or bad, and in the output itself. And the output is pretty what convinces us, really at first probably, that somehow this is the right approach, because we can think of the output as being good or bad. Like, in sense, the AI did a good work. I went to a conference recently in San Francisco, and the theme was put the AI to work. Was really the theme, right? It was how do we get it to work, to do some good work, right? And it's kind of easy to see what a good AI would produce in such a search domain, in a medical domain, a good diagnosis, for instance, or things like that. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. Now, here are the pushback, and they are quite different. I think they are important. The first one that came to my mind is at some point Aristotle talks about the maker envisioning. And I think this was another word that was used, but in the sense of envisioning or imagining or foreseeing the product, the end product, right? The object. Here we have a little problem, right? Because it is hard to see how that transfers to an AI. And indeed, if you think of an artist, a sculptor, sculpting a statue, he is going to see it before it's even there, right? It's going to imagine it. He's going to imagine it, envision it, foresee it, and that is not something that an AI does, right? Another related problem is that Aristotle clearly says that art is concerned with things, with the bringing into being of things that could be or not be, right? It's very important that it is about things that are viable, right? About things that are viable. It's about the viable, in the sense of it's about the things that could not be. And so there is the notion of, either it's going to be or not being. And the artist is a crucial piece in that, right? I mean, he's the one who actually makes the decision to sculpt or not sculpt, right? So it's completely up to him for this final object to be, it's completely up to his choice to be or not be. So here there is the crucial notion of choice. And And that doesn't seem to be something that an AI has. Now, we can argue about that, right? We can argue, we can involve some non-determinism, some sort of randomness. Now, we could say, well, is choice of the artist really random? Usually, again, like Aquinas and Aristotle say, the sculpture is going to be ordered into a hierarchy of goods, right? So it's going to do it for some kind of higher goods, right? It's going to be ordered into that hierarchy. So if it's ordered into that hierarchy, it falls into a rational process, not just random, right? So here there's another problem, the idea of a choice. Well, AI doesn't seem to have that choice, right? These 2 points, in terms of ethics, right? They kind of have the implication that they are about the existing versus non-existing, and the capacity for an artist to fill the gap between the not being and the being, right? And the goodness is involved in this capacity to fill the gap, right? To fill the gap between what is right now and what could be. And if that's true, then AI might not be concerned by that aspect of the good, right? So that's a first problem. First couple problems. Now there's another problem that came to my mind is the idea that no, there's another problem that someone actually pointed out that I didn't think of. The idea that the capacity is designed by men, right? Men and women. Sorry about that. It's designed. It's created, right? So it means we can describe and define its limits. And so an important consequence of that is that, well, then if it's designed by man and we can define its limits, it could mean that the goodness would be immediately transferred to the creator. Automatically, because basically the creator, because he's the one who actually designed the capacity itself to do well or not well, right? If the good is really in the capacity, right, of the person, like we said here, if it is first and above all not in the thing that is produced, but in the capacity to produce well, to do good things, right? Like a good artist, right? A good painter, he's a good painter because of his good capacity, right? But if this good capacity is only entirely designed by an external being, then he's good only insofar as the creator or the designer is good, not more than this. That doesn't mean that the AI is not good, but it's not good on its own per se, right? It's good purely and only because the designer is good. So here there's something interesting. And I would say, well, maybe men also are designed and created, and then you could say the same thing. Yeah, maybe, but there's still a problem here is that when we talk about the good of men and what is good for men, we're talking about something that we can't really completely nail down, in the sense that we talk about ourselves, and it's in itself something that is intrinsically complicated because we're talking about us, so we cannot completely point what it is. Well, if we design something, we can entirely define its limits, right? We can define its limits, and that's because we can describe the limits of this capacity and what this capacity is. So there is an asymmetry here between the good of human capacity and the good of machine capacity. It looks like there is an asymmetry. Another pushback, and I told you there would be a whole bunch again because this one is a bit less obvious, is the output. The output here, right? The output, there is something odd of thinking of the output of a computer program like the sculpture is the output of the artist. There is something very important that is repeated by Aristotle and Aquinas, is that the external object is not, right, is different, and we've talked about that before. It is different from the activity itself, right? The activity is not the object is not the activity. The output of a program is a little bit confusing here because the output can be somehow compared to part of the activity. I mean, if a computer, outputs a certain result on a screen, this result itself is really part of the computation. It's the end of the computation, but it's part of it, right? So there's a little problem here. If that is the computation, the energeia is really the output here. Or is it actually, here? And it actually matters, right? Because if it's actually just, we could say that it's part of the activity or visible, the visible part of the computation. Well, then it is part of the computation. It's just that the difference is that the rest of the computation is hidden, while this is visible, right? But that's not because it's visible, right, that all of a sudden it becomes an output. There could be actually visible parts all along the computation. That's another problem, right? You could have some outputs show, like logs, for instance, of a program, some kind of logging or things that just appear on the screen all along the computation, just like the visible part of a sculpture. There is the invisible part, the part that is capacity, what is thinking inside, how is going to cut this part of the wood next, etc. But there is also the visible part of what is doing. But all the visible parts along the process, if you look at him working, are not the output itself, right? The output is this object, material object. Now we could argue that it maybe doesn't have to be, but I'm going to put this on the side. But this object that is completely separated from the process itself. Does computation have that? Right? That's I think an important question. Does it have this end product separated from the activity? And it's important in terms of ethics because then there is no actual capacity if there is no output, right? No output means no capacity, because the two, as we've seen before, are intrinsically linked, and the capacity is what is good or bad. So it has an important implication in terms of ethics. Okay, so that was another pushback. Again, these are not like absolute pushback. They're just ideas, right? There's the last one, and then I promise I'm done. Last one is, well, it's kind of related to one of the objection against this pushback of the output was, well, what if the output is not just this part of the computation, but actually what it reveals, like, you know, the truth of something or some kind of reality or whatever. Yeah, that's actually an interesting argument, very interesting argument. Here we could say that the truth, what is revealed, is actually an interpretation from human beings. And without the human beings, the AI itself cannot be interpreted, right? And so therefore it doesn't contain intrinsically this good. But another thing that is interesting looking at it that way is that we realize that, well, isn't systematically the output and the process more about information, truth, what is and what is not, than it is about actually making something, right? So there is a problem with the maker hypothesis in the sense that the computation doesn't seem to be as much about working with some as working with some kind of external object from nature as it is about working on truth and assertions. You know, about what is and what is not. About actually truth in the absolute, right? When you do a 2 + 3 = 5 on a computer, you just go through a reasoning that is akin to syllogism in the process of building scientific knowledge, which is the episteme, right? We've looked at it shortly before. So then that's not anymore so if we look at it that way, we're not talking really about art as we're talking about production of knowledge, right? Through syllogisms, through reasoning. So the process would be more a process of building a theorem, right? Okay. And that's another problem, is that really because we're dealing with 0 and 1, with logic and mathematics in the basics of what a computation does, these are disciplines of eternal truth, of things that are inviolable, right? It's about the inviolable. And so it's not really what a maker does. That's not what he does. Okay, so these are a lot of pushbacks. So now, I mean, does it mean, and that's the important question, does it mean that we have to go back to, okay, so AI is just a regular tool? I don't think so. Because I think the arguments for the pushback against the regular tool are also very, very convincing, right? So I don't know what you think of that, and maybe you find a lot of those, some, on one side or the other, something really not convincing. But I would like, just in case you're really confused right now and you're thinking, what then is AI? What is it? If it's none of these, what is it? We know it's not a maker, it's not an actor, it's not a regular tool. uh, it's not it's not a we're not talking about scientific knowledge, in the sense, I mean, there is something about scientific knowledge, but scientific knowledge is not engaged into this kind of, I mean, it has an activity, but it's more of a um, demonstration activity, about demonstration, than what we AI engage usually with. So what is it? How does it fit? And so I would like to propose a solution, or maybe again a beginning of solution, because I don't think that's fully a solution. But what if we saw AI as emulation or modelization? I'm not sure what the word is, of the Energeia. And let me try to explain what I mean here. If again we say, we have a little artist here, he has this art capacity, and the process of the poiesis, the process of making, is also an energeia. It's an activity, right? Activity. Sorry about that. And then we have this external object, right? Okay, so that's our model. And I am actually going to yes. So okay. Well, what if actually this again, I'm gonna write it just a little below. What if what we did with AI is trying to reproduce that process, right? Look at it and recreate it artificially, right? So what if this Energeia has been modeled? We create a model here, right? And let's pick another color to show. Create a model, and then we implement this model into program, software, an AI, right? And well, then this software, and then when it's execution, engage into a computational activity that leads to a certain output. Now, that doesn't mean that the computational activity then is an energeia, in a sense of the being at work of the artist's capacity, right? That means that it's more like an emulation or imitation of the energeia itself. It's the actualization through the execution of a program that is the implementation of a model of that process, or a model of that capacity, right? And I'm not clear there yet, right? It's more of ideas here, not completely clear. But the model could be a model of the capacity itself, and the AI is an implementation of this capacity. But the key is here more to think of the computational activity not as an energeia itself, the AI not as this entity that has in itself a capacity for doing good or bad product, but more as the implementation of a model of this capacity. And so in some sense, that solves a lot of problem, because then it is not a regular tool. It is not a regular tool, and it's not a maker in itself, right? It's not a regular tool because we are precisely building something that imitates, repeats, or emulates, or implement the model of an actual human activity. And that's what's so confusing here, is that we took a human activity, we modeled it, we implemented it, and we recreate it artificially, and we can actually extend it through time as an activity that won't do exactly what a human does, but in some sense, what you put in and what you put out looks like what you put in and you put out on, in reality with a human, right? So so that means, the same way you can teach someone, well, then you can also teach an AI, because here too you have some kind of emulation process. Does it mean that we actually teach with data an AI the same way we actually teach a human? No, it's not the same teaching, and it's not teaching per se, but it's an emulation of teaching. It's an imitation. It's a artificial imitation, if you want. Okay, so it's, we can call that the emulation hypothesis. It's not a very formalized, beautiful theory, but I think it's an interesting theory that can give us some things to think about. But again, that means that the AI is not an artist. The computational activity is not the ENERG AI. It's not the poiesis and the output. It's not a product in this sense, because it is the fruit of a modelization and implementation using computation and computer science, but it's not also a regular tool, right? Because it has this very unique capability that no tool from ancient times had, right? Obviously. But now there is still the problem. There is still this issue, right? The episteme, the syllogism, right? It doesn't look like the output is really this thing built that is completely separated from the activity. It still looks like, and in this sense, it would be interesting to see, well, what if actually, rather than an emulation of this process of the artist, it's not rather an emulation of not art, but the capacity that we call scientific knowledge, episteme, right? That's through a process of syllogism and deliberation and proof, reaches some kind of truth. That can be like, for instance, a theorem. But a theorem in a demonstration is really also part of the demonstration. So it kind of matches this idea that it's not separated, the truth that we reach from a conclusion, right? If you say, well, A is true, and A imply B is true, therefore B is true. Well, B is really part of the process. It's a conclusion of the process, but it's part of it. In the same way that an output is part of a computation. So we should wonder if that would not be a better model, right? And if in some sense an AI is not rather an emulation of that process. And we could say, well, no, in the sense that an AI is not always about like absolute truth. You're gonna try to categorize pictures as birds and not birds, and you can make mistake. You can say things that are not absolute eternal truth, but based on what it is given, its computation is flawless, right? I mean, if there's no flaw, there's no working against nature, there's no resistance from nature, right? When a maker making something the capacity to do something well, to do a good statue, or to build a good house, is also to work with nature and the element and to adapt to circumstances that resist to your vision, right? So your vision is also going to change, it's going to move, and in some sense that's what in some sense also, a computer scientist is doing when he's building, or programmer when he's building a program. He's actually an artist in this sense, because things can change, right? I mean, it can, maybe there is a module or library that is not available anymore in Java, and it has to change, or it has to maybe change programming language. I mean, there is so many factors that come into the building process, and the end product is going to somehow come from that vision, but also be changing with all these variable elements. In this sense, it has to do with the variable and not with the inviolable. Computation in itself, it is hard to say that it has to do with the variable. You could say, well, I mean, the computer program maybe could have some external elements. Is that really true? Are there any external elements that can come, into the process, and can the AI really learn from that contradiction? If you just cut the power completely, you completely stop the process. I mean, the AI doesn't have any more power, and it's not gonna learn from it the way that a sculptor who is just hitting a hard knot on a statue is going to learn something about how to work with that, through frustration, through resistance. So there is also something to be said about syllogism and deliberation being closer to that process that computational activity is going on through. And then that means, well, that ethics is really not that much involved in that, right? Because it's if it's just about truth, it's just about truth, right? There is no way to, if that's true, there's no way to really build a really bad AI, in the sense that someone could be a bad sculptor, right? So again, these are more proposition of way of thinking of this, and I'm gonna let you with that, even though it can seem a bit chaotic, but we have to go through some chaos and some slow resolution to really try to open new questions, which is always very important, but also try to clear a path toward a solution. And I hope that this presentation achieved at least partially that goal. Thank you very much.